Welcome. Welcome. We see you all coming in. We'll give you just a moment. Good evening. For those who are just joining us, we count it an honor that you would take your time to be with us in this provoking conversation this evening. We're beginning in 1 minute. Welcome. If you'd be so kind in the meantime as to place who you are and where you're from in the chat and your pronouns, that would be greatly appreciated. Yes, there is a chat box that you all should be able to see where you can put your name and where you're coming from and your pronouns. Thank you. Perfect. Phenomenal. Welcome. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started in an effort to honor your time and to give space and room for this extremely provoking conversation this evening. My name is Dominique Hardy, and I am the Director of Race and Gender Equity at the YWCA of Central Massachusetts, where our esteemed and phenomenal CEO is Debbie Halls. And on behalf of the YWCA of Central Massachusetts, we have to say to you, welcome, but we are so grateful that you are with us. And so as we move along here, I just have a few housekeeping rules for you. Yes, if you'd be so kind as to engage us, and we will not be having a question and answer session at the end, because we are going to do things a little bit differently. Because of the nature of the conversation this evening, what we're actually going to do is give you an opportunity to share your questions and for our part 2. Yes, you heard me correctly. There will be a part 2. And we already have confirmation of our gracious panelists. So go ahead and write in your calendars, February the 1st. Tonight's conversation is entitled Reproductive Equity Post Roe v. Wade. Many of you have heard reproductive equity conversations prior to Roe v. Wade overturning, but we all know that the conversation dramatically shifts now that this ruling has been overturned. And this is the place and the point that we want to really engage on a deeper level these questions. Welcome. We see you all still coming in. Welcome, Amy. Welcome, Kim. I know I missed quite a few people there in the chat, but welcome. And so we also ask for your grace and patience with any technical difficulties, which we do not foresee. However, if for any reason we are wrong, don't panic, take a deep breath, and come back on using the same link that you initially used to log on, and give us about 3 to reconnect. In other words, don't just leave and go have dinner. Come on back, okay? We will be back. And now, without further ado, I am so thankful for our esteemed panelists this evening, but actually, we are going to go ahead and introduce them. So give us just a moment. And then after that, we have an incredibly provoking presentation by one of these esteemed panelists, specifically on the history of abortion rights. Now, I know that you have heard many conversations on abortion, but how many of you have actually heard about a synopsis of the history? Because before we can appropriately engage this conversation on what is reproductive equity and how now that lens changes through Roe v. Wade overturning, we must first engage the history. For it is only in understanding the history can we have a proper framework for the current reality. And so first, we have the wonderful, I say Professor Jennifer Nye, JD. She is currently the Senior Lecturer 2 in History, Law, and Social Justice in the History Department, University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she teaches courses on the history of reproductive rights law, social movement lawyering, and constitutional law. And I will just say she has been so gracious and willing and knowledgeable, great personality, I may add, because even in this entire list of credentials, we all know that that does not account for people's personalities. And I can personally say through the time that I've known her that she has been extremely personable, knowledgeable, and we are so honored that she is with us. And she will actually add on to the host of other things that she has done, because it is quite extensive, but they will have that opportunity when we actually start engaging the questions. So thank you, Jennifer, for being with us. Next, we have Meredith Tuitt, and she is a United States Navy veteran, political consultant, community activist, and a strong advocate for women and girls, which directly aligns with the work that we're doing at the YWCA, obviously. And so that is really, really incredible. She is the program manager of the Veterans Outreach Center of Harvard Street Neighborhood Health Center. And she will also probably share a little bit about her extensive political, advocacy and all of the things that she has done. It is truly an honor to have you with us, Meredith, and she will also share probably a little bit more on the Massachusetts Committee for Status for Women, And so thank you so much for being with us. And then we also have Dr. Laurie Jefferson, PhD. She is the director for the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy at UMass Boston, and a graduate program director for the Gender Leadership and Public Policy Graduate Certificate Program. And she has held faculty and senior scientist positions at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management, where she was affiliated with the Institute for Child, Youth, and Family Policy, and much, much more. She also has extensive advocacy efforts in the diversity, equity, and inclusion field. And so we are deeply grateful that you are with us as well. And at this time, we also want to thank, of course, our own marketing coordinator, as well as the people from the YWCA who are represented here, who have been so gracious to help in front of the scenes and behind the scenes, Craig and Alyssa. And at this time, we would like for you to meet, and many of you probably already know her, our esteemed CEO, Debbie Haas.
Wonderful. I will thank you for that, Dominique. I'm not going to take up a lot of time. I just want to welcome everyone because I'm interested in getting to this conversation. But as Dominique said, this is part of a series of conversations around reproductive equity, because we know one conversation will not suffice. So for those of you who signed up for this program, look forward to an email with the date. I know Dominique gave that to you February 1st, but that will be coming to you all soon. So again, thank you for joining us for what I know is going to be a robust conversation that we want to get to as quickly as possible. I'll turn it back over to you.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much. Well, at this time, let's get into the meat of this conversation. So we're going to first start with a brief presentation by Jennifer, and you see their pronouns up here as well. And so if you all, have any questions, then please let us know. It does appear that we did not introduce one of our esteemed panelists. Last but definitely not least, we are so thankful for Nandini. We thank you so much for the time and the effort that you have put in being here. I would actually, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, and I actually would like you to share a line or two of who you are and what you do with Fenway Health.
Of course, and everyone, it's nice to meet you virtually, and thank you for joining us on this important discussion. And Dominique, thank you so much for the warm welcome. I am the Reproductive Health Equity Specialist at Fenway Health's Reproductive Health and OBGYN department. And this is my passion and life work so far, and I'm just grateful to be here and share the platform with my esteemed colleagues here.
Yes, I particularly appreciated, obviously, all of our panelists, but specifically, Nandini, it was so fascinating to me for me to research and learn about the work that she was doing, because obviously we're having a conversation today about reproductive equity, and that is literally, she's literally a reproductive equity specialist, which I was very intrigued by, because from my understanding, even in the people that I know, people were saying that they had never even heard necessarily of a reproductive equity specialist. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for your life's work. So at this time, we will have a brief presentation by Jennifer, and then we will engage in this conversation.
Thank you, Dominique. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll all see my PowerPoint. Oh,
yes.
Excuse me. Okay. So thank you so much for having me today. Dominique asked me to kind of give a brief overview of reproductive equity and the right to abortion. I teach a class, a semester-long class called The History of Reproductive Rights Law. So I tried to like squish that into a short PowerPoint, which my partner said is actually going to be 45 minutes. I'm going to try not to make it that. And so if I start to go over, if you could give me a nod, I will skip to the end. So as you can see, I renamed this Reproductive Inequity and the Right to Abortion, because I think, although I know we're going to have another conversation, a broader conversation, I think, about reproductive justice and the scope of that, I just wanted to acknowledge at the outset that there's never been reproductive equity in the United States. So the question of whether or when or how many children a person has, whether you're able to raise those children, much less raise them in favorable circumstances, has never been equally or equitably distributed in the United States. The more marginalized you are in the United States, the less reproductive autonomy you have. Reproductive autonomy is always bound by law. I'm thinking here of slavery, of criminal laws, of immigration laws, criminal laws against abortion and against birth control, race, indigeneity, class, income, insurance status, age, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, immigration status. I've probably left some things out, but I did want to say that at the outset. And from my perspective, at least, access to legal and safe abortion, no matter what kinds of criticisms we might level at the inadequacy of Roe as a legal decision, in my opinion as a feminist, that access to legal and safe abortion is necessary but not sufficient to reproductive equity, autonomy, and justice. And maybe you'll get a sense of that as I continue to give a little brief overview. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about abortion law pre-Roe v. Wade, which was decided by the Supreme Court in 1972. First, I wanted to point out that, or acknowledge that abortion has not always been illegal in the United States, that at common law, it was legal through quickening, which was the moment when a woman could feel the fetus moving inside of her. Criminalization of abortion began in the 1980s as a way to protect, not to protect fetal life, but to really solidify professional medical power and authority of doctors and to promote white reproduction. And abortion restrictions have often coincided with women's demands for autonomy, equality, and self-determination. In other words, women's demands to be seen as more than mothers. So that's kind of the just a brief overview about the law. That it's not always, the thing to take away is not always been illegal, and that it's evolved over time. It's also important, I think, to understand that the laws regulating abortion have primarily been state criminal laws and not federal national laws, because we're getting into that debate now post the Dobbs decision. Abortion access pre-Roe v. Wade. So this is the question of access is different from the question of legality, because we know from history that people will seek abortions even when the procedure is criminalized. We know that from other countries around the world currently where abortion is illegal. The World Health Organization estimates that there are about 25 million illegal abortions in countries where abortion is illegal. We know this from US history in the 1950s and 60s. Illegal abortion estimates ranged from 200,000 to 1.2 million annually. And prior to Roe, as many as 5,000 American women died per year from unsafe abortions. And again, those numbers are stratified. We also know that deaths were much higher among women of color, Black women, Latino women, than they were from white women, because white women often had the means to seek safer abortions. Because the other aspect of this is that even in regimes of illegal abortion, an illegal abortion doesn't necessarily mean an unsafe abortion. And so even in the United States, when abortion was criminalized, some women were able to access hospital abortions. If they met certain circumstances, they had to appeal to a medical board that would determine whether or not the abortion was medically necessary. There were mutual aid organizations like Jane in Chicago and the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion, which helped connect women to abortion providers who would provide safer abortions. And that all of this access to a safe, but an illegal, but safer abortion depended on a woman's particular, race, class, pregnancy status. I have something in my screen, there it is, where she lived, what her pregnancy situation was, and other things. So I want to talk about three court decisions. I want to talk about Roe v. Wade, which was decided in 1973. I want to talk about the Casey decision that was decided in 1992, and I want to talk about the most recent decision. Roe v. Wade was a Supreme Court decision by 7-2, decided in 1973. It struck down a Texas law criminalizing abortion. There are two key rulings from that people should keep in their mind. The first was that the court held that a fetus is not a person under the 14th Amendment. And the court also ruled that the 14th Amendment privacy right is broad enough to protect a woman's right to decide to terminate a pregnancy in consultation with her doctor. The court also found that there are two compelling state interests. One state interest is protecting women's health, and the other state interest is protecting potential fetal life. With that, the Roe court announced a standard for determining the constitutionality of state abortion restrictions. So we never have had in this country abortion on demand, which some people who are against legal abortion will say. That's never been the case. There's always been a legal framework where states can regulate abortion. The trimester framework that the Roe court announced held that in the first trimester, there can really be no state regulation because abortion is safer than pregnancy and childbirth, so that there's no women's health interest because abortion is safer, and there's no interest in fetal life because the fetus can't live outside the uterus. So that's an abortion that happens in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, which is when about 80% or more of abortions happen. The second trimester, a state can pass restrictions on abortion to protect women's health. And in the third trimester, the state can regulate and even ban abortion, but they have to have a health or life exception for the life of the pregnant person. And the reason for that kind of moving is because the court found that after viability, that the state had more of an interest, or actually had an interest, in regulating the potential for fetal life, because it was only at viability when a fetus could live outside of the uterus. And that was true in 1973, and viability hasn't changed that much. It's around 24 weeks, depending on the fetus. So when you hear about abortion bans at 20 weeks, there's never been a 20-week fetus that has lived. We just don't have the technology to do that. The other thing to understand is that Roe established a negative right to be free from state intervention, not a positive right to demand state action. So it wasn't a ruling that made abortion accessible to everybody or funding for abortion care accessible to everybody. It just prevented criminalization. The next case was, there were other cases, but the next important case that I want to talk about is the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case, which was decided in 1992. That upheld the core principles of Roe, finding that a woman's reliance on Roe weighs in favor of upholding the right to abortion. But it rejected the court's trimester framework for determining when a state can regulate abortion and announced a new standard, saying that only state regulations that impose an undue burden on a woman's ability to make the abortion decision are invalid. And an undue burden is a state regulation that has the purpose or effect of placing a substantial obstacle in the path of a woman seeking an abortion of a non-viable fetus. So from the moment that Roe v. Wade was decided through Casey and after, there has been a lot of activism against legal abortion and against abortion access. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of those that implicate issues that I think we will be concerned with. The first one was that the anti-abortion activists attempted was a human life amendment to the Constitution. That did not pass, but it was something that was attempted. I don't know if that's going to be revised depending on if the Republicans retake control of the presidency or the legislature. Access restrictions that target poor and young women, and by extension, women of color. In 1977, the Hyde Amendment was passed by Congress, which bars federal Medicaid funding for abortion, and that was upheld in a 1980 Supreme Court decision, Harris v. McRae. And that had really devastating consequences for limiting the access to abortion services for low-income people in the United States. Parental notice and consent laws with judicial bypass that required minors to get parental notice or consent in order to access an abortion. 36 states, including Massachusetts, have those laws. There's been violence against abortion providers, including clinic blockades, arsons, bombings, harassment, murder of abortion doctors, which led to the 1994 Freedom to Access to Clinics Act. After Casey, there's an increasing number of state laws regulating abortion. There's also an increasing number of crisis pregnancy centers. I have the numbers there so you can kind of see how those are connected to each other. Crisis pregnancy centers often put themselves next to abortion providers, and people can be confused about whether they're going to learn about all of their options or just one option. And finally, the rights prioritizing the appointment of conservative anti-abortion judges. That's probably the biggest thing, and the biggest reason why we're here today talking about post-Roe is because of the judges. So that brings us to Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health in 2000. Trying to see if I've lost track of my time.
You're doing great.
Okay.
A couple more minutes, yeah?
Okay, so Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, that's the case that the court most recently issued. That issue was a Mississippi law that banned abortion at 15 weeks. It's the first pre-viability state ban that had been taken up by the court since Roe. Usually those got stopped by the lower courts because everybody agreed that was fundamentally unconstitutional under Roe. But Mississippi passed that law with the intention of trying to frontally challenge Roe v. Wade so that the court would overturn it. And that is exactly what the court did. The court overturned Roe v. Casey. Importantly, they did not rule that a fetus is a person underneath the 14th Amendment, but it did return the issue to the states. The court, Alito is the judge who wrote the decision, and he used analysis called originalism for interpreting the Constitution, which basically looks at what happened, what was going on at the time that the Constitution or the amendment was written. And the decision ruled that in order for a right to be protected by the Constitution, it must be either explicitly spelled out in the text of the Constitution or deeply rooted in our history and tradition. And by applying what I would call, and what many historians and legal scholars would call, a misreading of history to justify the overturning of Roe v. Wade, found that the right to abortion wasn't deeply rooted in our history and tradition, and so therefore it should be overturned. I should note that the court did not, even though there were briefs filed by historians, the court did not cite to any of those briefs for the history, instead citing to some briefs of non-historians. The court also gave little regard to women's reliance on abortion in the last 50 years. That's contrary to what Sandra Day O'Connor did when she wrote the majority opinion in the Casey case. She talked at length about how people who could become pregnant had relied, she used the word women, but I'm trying to be inclusive here, had relied on access to abortion to determine and make decisions about their lives, about how many children they have, about when they would go to school, about, you know, when they would get married, and make decisions about employment. And that because of that reliance, in her view, it wasn't proper for the court to overturn a precedent. But as I said, this court ruled differently, and they returned the issue to the states. So a couple of things. So why, I think this is maybe answering one of the questions, like why should we care about this decision? So I would say that this decision harms people who are facing unwanted pregnancies, and there's a turn-away study that was done by the University of California, San Francisco, about what happened to people who sought abortion services but did not receive them. And there's a citation to that in a resource guide that I think we're going to put in the chat so people can see the kinds of harms that people who are denied abortion care encounter. It also harms the reproductive health of people with wanted pregnancies who might face pregnancy complications, miscarriage, ectopic pregnancies. We've heard all about these stories reported in the news already of people having to travel out of state, risking their lives, risking their future reproductive capacity because they're being denied needed medical care in their home states. It also potentially criminalizes behavior during pregnancy, and we know that has already happened several times. It also threatens other unenumerated rights that are based on the 14th Amendment. So Alito says in his decision that the Dobbs decision will not be used as precedent for overturning other Supreme Court cases. And I would say that we should not believe him, and instead we should believe Thomas's concurrence, where he explicitly says that decisions that legalize birth control, sodomy, gay marriage, and other unenumerated rights should be reconsidered. And that's how the law works, for better or for worse, is that cases are used as precedent in other similar cases. And so Alito can't say Dobbs can't be used. People will use this case to do exactly what Thomas is saying. They've already talked about trying to use it that way. The other thing I would say is that this isn't the end. Remember that I said that Dobbs didn't really comment on one aspect of the Roe decision, which was fetal personhood. So the next step in my mind is that the anti-abortion movement is not going to be satisfied with the issue being returned to the states and having a patchwork of legality and criminality regarding abortion. They've already asked for a nationwide ban, some of the activists, and/or they're going to ask for a Supreme Court decision announcing that there's a constitutional right to fetal personhood under the 14th Amendment. That's my prediction. How is a post-Roe U.S. different from a pre-Roe U.S.? There's a couple of things I wanted to mention. One is the advent of abortion pills, which can be used, I believe, up to 11 weeks of pregnancy. These did not exist in 1973, and the majority of abortions right now are being done with medication abortions, with abortion pills, rather than the medical abortions, and that's something that can be done in your home in a more private setting. It can be done by getting the pills through the mail if you live in a state that has illegal abortion laws. So the abortion pills change the conversation a bit, I think. There's a more organized mutual aid to support access to abortion. There's a national network of abortion funds. There's 4 abortion funds in Massachusetts, one of which was started in 2018 called Tides for Reproductive Freedom, and that was started explicitly and specifically by people of color and queer people. And so there are funds available for people, but even so, we know nationally that 35% of the callers are only 35% are actually getting assistance. So more than half of folks aren't able to get assistance. We have a number of abortion-friendly states, including Massachusetts, than I think we did in 1973. But we also have a larger and more well-funded criminal justice system due to mass criminalization and mass incarceration. And, you know, individual prosecutors at the very local level have a lot of discussion about the kinds of cases they're going to bring. And so we need to be mindful that, you know, when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, and there are police out there taking calls, and there are prosecutors out there looking for things to prosecute. And if they believe that abortion shouldn't be legal, then they're going to be enforcing those laws to the extent that they're able to do that. I just wanted to give folks a little summary. We have the Roe Act here in Massachusetts. It not only codifies the right to abortion and eliminates parental notice for 16 and 17-year-olds, it allows for abortion after 24 weeks for grave fetal anomalies. In 2022, after the Dobbs decision, the Roe Act was extended to extend protection for those charged in other states for abortion-related crimes, so that Massachusetts has agreed that they're not going to extradite anybody who you know, has charges pending against them in another state. They're not gonna, if a doctor, you know, mails somebody abortion pills, and then that state that the person in that state that receives the pills, they file something against the doctor, they're not gonna lose their Massachusetts medical license for any criminal charges. It also bars the state from assisting any other out-of-state investigations.
Dr. Nye?
Yes, should I stop?
Yes, this is a perfect time. This was excellent. Thank you so much.
So
I will say this. This is so rich and such a wealth of information for those who are asking. Yes, this actually will be on our YouTube channel so that you can recap this information. And we also encourage you all to join part 2, where we'll have a little bit more time to get into some of these nuances. And so thank you for that. That was excellent. And we're going to move swiftly now into, now that we have that framework, we're going to move swiftly into the questions. So here we go. With that being said, and this question is for you know, anyone who feels so compelled to answer on this panel. Question number 1. Many people view the overturning of Roe v. Wade as a cishet woman's issue. Cishet meaning cisgender and heterosexual. And if a person doesn't fall within that strict parameter, most people think that Roe v. Wade is not relevant to people who are non-gender conforming. But in an effort to center all vulnerable bodies, my question is, in what specific ways does the overturning of Roe v. Wade uniquely impact the trans and gender non-conforming community? We are asking that each panelist would keep their comments to 1 to 2 minutes.
So I can kick off this discussion, Dominique. What makes me a specialist in reproductive health is that I focus my work on LGBTQIA+, transgender and gender diverse health. And I think a common myth that people may have heard of is that abortion rights and reproductive health rights are strictly for cisgender het women. That's not the case. We have folks walking into our clinic who identify as transgender and gender diverse who have the capacity to be pregnant and who also do come in for contraceptive care counseling. So if you strictly think in the binary, that's not fair, right? You have to think beyond the binary lens because it affects anyone who has the capacity to be pregnant. And this directly correlates with the anti-trans policies that we have seen coming through, removing the rights for folks to determine what they want to do with their body, which is what the overturn of Roe v. Wade essentially did to folks who had the capacity to be pregnant.
Excellent and insightful. Thank you. Would anyone else like to quickly add to that?
Yeah, a few things I'd like to say is, and this might be surprising to many of us, the highest concentration of trans people in the United States live in the South, which is also the place where there's the most stringent abortion restrictions or bans in place. And, even though we know that some people who are seeking abortions will go out of state, others, especially Black trans people and other trans people of color, may be not have that option due to the fact that they're as lower income in many instances. So one of the things that we know is that trans folks are more likely to struggle with poverty and job discrimination, and many are lacking the resources to cover the procedure and the cost to travel. And the U.S. Trans Survey that came out in 2015, which was one of the most in-depth examination of transgender life in this country, found that, twice as many people, transgender people, are living in poverty. And if you look at trans people of color, that's even higher numbers. So that's something that I think is critically important to raise. And I think the other piece that's important to raise is that it's hard enough for trans people to get health care, generally speaking, and that's scary enough. But then you go on and you're trying to get an abortion as well in in states that are restrictive, and top the poverty off on that as well. There's a lot to consider, a lot of concerns and challenges.
Well, wow, our framework right now of what we thought reproduction equity was and who it was for has just totally been obliterated through you two sharing that. So thank you for that and opening up this conversation and access for all people. Okay, and so we're going to move swiftly along, and then we're going to circle back given that our time permits. Is that okay with you all panelists? Okay. So with that being said, I want to hone in on what our last esteemed panelist stated, because that makes me wonder then. The question on the floor at this time is, do you foresee out-of-state abortions being banned? And to clarify for people, specifically, if abortion is banned in a particular state, some people may say, okay, well, given that I have the resources, and we know that's not always the case, as both of you just stated, all three of you just stated in different ways, given that I have the resources and, a person wants to have an abortion, they'll just cross state lines to a state that has not prohibited that opportunity. Do you foresee that being banned specifically, based upon your expertise?
I can jump in here, sister. So I want to say that I do see that there are states that are, I'm sorry for the background noise. I do see that many of the states that are banning abortion within their borders are going to try to go ahead and make it criminal offense if you go across the border, and that's something that we as advocates for women and women's rights need to be more focused in on when it comes to the possibility that this is going to occur. Because if we are already struggling with the reproductive rights within the state, and then they make it criminal to go across the border, now our fear, and within the communities, especially disenfranchised communities, right? If that does occur, how do we protect those women and their families that might be impacted by something like that? And that's something that we should be looking at. And I know MCSW has thought about it also, and just really wonder about how would we, as a state that wouldn't do something like that, support the other states. And I know Massachusetts is making it all right if you come to Massachusetts, but what if they have to stay What if they can't go back to their state? How do we then work? How do we do that? How do we get our congressional members to think about how to protect what you would call cross-border travel?
That's excellent. I hope you all are holding tight to these provoking questions. You just said, how do we protect? How will we protect folks? I mean, so that is so great. Professor Jennifer, is there anything that you want to quickly add to that based upon your expertise on whether out-of-state abortions, do you foresee that being banned?
So I think of that as having two parts. One is, what will the radical right do, which is one question, and the other is, what's the state of the law? So I think absolutely there are people out there that want to ban travel out and, you know, prosecute people who have abortions or use abortion pills and then come back into their home state. Either making it a criminal law or doing a bounty kind of law like Texas did, which is really just, you know, a crazy, you know, destruction of the rule of law. That kind of bounty system has no basis in the history of law. They just kind of made it up. And that's terrifying, because it's really a question of like, are we going to not have the rule of law? Much as we might critique it, the rule of law, in my mind, is better than not having the rule of law, because then you have ways to try to change the law. But so yes, I think states might try it, although I'm heartened by the election results that maybe still have a democracy, you know, moving, you know, in the right direction. But there's also a constitutional right to travel. And so they would have to do other kinds of work to criminally prosecute people for traveling, which I don't know what the Supreme Court would do with that. So there's more steps to that, I think, because there is a constitutional right to travel, which is very complicated. So that would be my sense about that. But I think, Meredith, your point about what are we going to do to people who come here, I think is such an excellent question. And I think we saw just a little bit about it when DeSantis tried to send people to Martha's Vineyard, how people in Massachusetts responded. I hope that we would have that same openness, but we also need a long-term response, not just housing people temporarily the way that we respond to immigrants.
Excellent.
And I think some other things, that there's strong arguments, you know, that such a law, you know, would be somewhat unconstitutional. There's issues around, you know, state sovereignty, and as you just mentioned, Professor Nye, the right to travel. You know, there are a number of, there's a dormant commerce clause. There are a number of ways in which you could fight this. Although I would have to say also in Minnesota, there was an attempt to actually, in Missouri, I'm sorry, a bill was pending that would enforce abortion restriction to civil lawsuits if abortion was outside the state. So it seems like just it could go either way. And I think that there have been some direct precedents, and on the other hand, there's many arguments against why this would not work, because in terms of constitutionality.
Excellent. Wow, wow, wow. We just opened up a can of worms.
Sorry, Dominique, can I jump in?
Sure, absolutely.
So also what I'm thinking, when we have these conversations and we're talking about safety and protection of our women and girls that need to travel across the border, one of the things we need to think about, and MCSW is looking at it, is how do we talk about reproductive rights stabilization, where we are looking at a full package of how do we focus in on and do like Colorado and other states like Arkansas are trying to do, where we do the IUDs and for free, and where we do all of these other health sexual health safety causes that would kind of assist us in the fact that we don't have to worry about how we're going to protect our sisters. You know what I mean? So just put that in. I just wanted to drop that in everybody's mindset. So how do we do the stabilization of family, reproductive life,
I think that's excellent. A really, really important point, something I was going to bring up later on, because at the end of the day, we have all these threats to abortion, but we also know that low-income women, women of color, Indigenous women, there's so many groups that don't have access to contraceptives, don't have health education, don't have finances in order to get what they need. So, you know, we can't look at abortion in isolation without looking at all those issues that, you know, that surround it. And I think that your point is really well taken.
Yeah, a wraparound approach. Because a lot of times people try to single this issue and in some ways encapsulate it without addressing some of the pieces that everyone really has mentioned on this panel. So that's a great framework and perspective by which we will move on to this next question along with that framework in mind. So the next question is, and personally, I've never heard this one asked before, so I'm very curious about y'all's responses. How does the overturning of abortion rights uniquely impact the cisgender women enlisted in the military? And before you respond, I just want to just say to folks, you know, there are people in the military who do not identify as women, but may be forced to be there because they have been drafted as men because they are assigned male at birth. Okay, or they may be told they are women, even though they do not personally identify as women, because as far as the last time I checked anyway, I think that the military has a very binary approach. I don't, you know, again, I'm not up to date on that piece, but so the question again is, I'm going to make sure that I read you both parts. How does the overturning of abortion rights uniquely impact the cisgender women enlisted in the military? And then also, how does the overturning of abortion rights uniquely impact the gender non-conforming individuals listed in the military, as well as this transgender community? Please limit your responses to 1 minute.
I'll jump in. So DOD Pentagon does not pay for abortions. The only way that it'll occur, it has to be rape, incest, or health issues, health impact. So it doesn't affect, and the federal government states it. They will continually state it, that no one can tell the federal government, the Pentagon, or the DOD how to deal with the health issues on military bases or to military attached, because when we join the military, we give our body to the government of the United States of America to protect the country. So we fall under their care, and the word care. So it doesn't matter what our gender dialogue is. They do not do abortion unless it is rape, incest, or health issues. So it's not going to change.
I can't let the statement go that you just said. And the statement was something like, when you enlist in the military, your body belongs to the United States of America, so far as it pertains to their framework. So very interesting shift to this conversation. Any other thoughts on that?
And I think, you know, in regards to transgender and gender diverse folks in the military, it's still unsafe for them to disclose their identity because of federal laws, because it's still unsafe to disclose sexuality still and your transgender and gender diverse identity. So with that being said, it bears to think about if a transgender or gender diverse person does need an abortion and they are serving in the military actively, whether they feel safe to approach healthcare facilities and disclose who they are. So it just bears a thought in terms of equitable access and when it's safe to disclose identities.
I have one question or thought about that, because it seems like regardless of somebody's gender identity, that if you need an abortion and you're serving on a base that's now in a state that's restricted, it's become much more difficult because we know that after Dobbs, I think something like 66 abortion clinics closed across the country. And I am not a military expert, so I'm going to have Mary confirm or deny what I'm saying. But the question that I'm interested in is, will the military make exceptions for people to get more leave, because we know they have to travel further. Like if you're in a base in Texas or in Georgia where abortion is restricted and you have to now travel to another state, I would imagine that your life just became much more difficult to access that needed care because of the state-by-state restriction.
So military bases are federal property. They are not state owned. If you notice in previous issues that have occurred, you will see that it is federal guidelines, federal police, federal law. Again, the Pentagon does not pay for abortions unless it's rape, incest, or health issue. So unless you go to MedCall and report a rape, unless you go to MedCall and report some form of incest, unless you go to MedCall and they say you have a health issue, they are not going to cover that abortion. So if you need an abortion for any other reason than those three, then that is something you would have to figure out to be able to take your own leave from base, take your vacation time, and go in and take care of that outside of that state that you're in.
Wow. Wow. That really highlights a whole new level of inequity within that particular metron, that particular structure. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. And you all, we hope that you don't just, we still have some questions and some time here, but we hope that you don't just hear it and say, oh, that's unfortunate, and move on. We want to walk away from this conversation mobilized, okay? A step further than you were prior to you joining us. And so that is very, very critical, I feel like, to this conversation. With that being said, I want to, for a moment, get mobilized. Besides educating themselves and voting, what one additional actionable step can people who live in fear of this actualized overturning take each day to maintain their own empowerment? I specifically on this want Nandini to start that particular question or answer. Yeah.
Take the courage to instate and develop equitable sexual health education that pertains to underserved communities of color and LGBTQIA+ communities. I think in this conversation, we touched on this a little bit, how there's a deficit in sexual health education, sex ed education in schools, and even in healthcare settings. And one of the things that I'm proud of is that at Fenway Health, we have advocacy programs, for example, the Activist Academy program, where we specifically teach our students how to develop equitable sex ed classes that address a lot of the issues that we talked about. So discussing, what does contraceptive care look like? Where can you get contraceptive care? And little plug for Fenway, we do offer contraceptive care, counseling, and services for sliding scale fees. We are working on making it a little bit more accessible, where we can offer contraceptive care for free. That's the goal, but we do offer sliding scale fees for folks. But I think if folks who are in states where you don't have the flexibility, or the overturn of Roe v. Wade has completely affected the way that you can operate, you still have the ability to raise your voice and advocate and develop sexual health and sex ed education to sort of combat these hardships.
Excellent. And before I would love to hear, at least on this particular one, if you all can keep it to 1 minute. I would actually love to hear from all three of you about what can someone do. We at this point, I think most people, they understand the voting piece, got it. Education, got it. But what else? Because people are here feeling helpless. And to Nandini's point, I remember with the rally that the YWCA just did, one of the things that I told folks is that, listen, just because Roe v. Wade has been overturned does not mean your voice needs to be overturned. And so, you know, we don't just need to just give up and say, well, this is just what happened, but it's really important that we can follow some actionable steps here. And so, Dr. Laurie, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, you talked about voting, and that's really important, but you have to have someone that's on your side who's thinking like you're thinking around reproductive justice to vote for. So one of the things I say, and of course, coming from the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, where we really focus on women's representation as well as representation, particularly for women of color, we need to get more women and people of color running for office that have reproductive justice and gender equity as a framework in which they want to work from. So I think that's really, really critically important. I think we also have to work with our, with our women's organizations, with our LGBTQ organizations, our disability organizations, and our people of color organizations, and really, make this a top priority on their agenda, because it's not always a top priority on all these agendas. So I think, and then also give individuals and organizations the tools and the strategies in order to help them to make a difference, because you just can't make a difference if you don't have the strategic tools to do that, along with the passion.
Thank you, sister.
Really wonderful.
I want to say both of you have stolen my notes. Advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. If you don't know your legislator, get to know your legislator. Representative Jim O'Day out of Worcester had a bill, Healthy Choice, which was about human sexual education and human sexuality issues in the school system in a competent way for each grade level, right? And yep. If we continue supporting him, supporting legislators that are like him, like-minded, Representative soon-to-be Senator Liz Miranda around reproductive rights, if we support those legislators and we keep pushing the issue about the fact that we have to start education not in high school, we have to go to middle school, because we know knowledge is power. So we have to do our advocacy work. We have to take action and to find solutions to everything that is impacting our women and girls across the Commonwealth.
I think that's important.
Wonderful. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Laurie, and then we'll do Professor Nye. Mm-hmm.
I just think it's important to just, say, without reproductive justice and gender equity, there's no economic justice, there's no racial, LGBT, disability justice. Reproductive freedom is essential to freedom everywhere and with everything. And I think we need to center that.
That right there, mic drop. We could post that over the entire, matter of fact, we could have started with that sentence. Because if those rights are stripped, what else do we have? Mm-hmm. That's your body. What else do you, what else is then off limits? And so that is excellent context. Professor Jennifer, what are your thoughts on this?
I guess it's hard to add on to what people said, but I kind of think in categories. So I think one, harm reduction. People should think harm reduction, which I think of as like kind of short term, like helping people on the ground who are being harmed. So like give to abortion funds, not just here, but also in places where there are abortion restrictions, or give of your time to those funds. They need help. But also, I think not just harm reduction, because I think sometimes the left can get too focused, not too focused, but it's to our benefit. We care about people. Sometimes I feel like the right doesn't necessarily care about people. So we also have to be thinking long-term. And for me, thinking long-term in terms of systemic change is you know, if I had my goals, we would get rid of the Electoral College, we would secure voting rights, we would expand the Supreme Court, and we would have a long-term goal to overturn jobs. And I think that's because, you know, it was a 50-year plan that the right had to overturn Roe. We need our own plan, and I would say we can do it in 18 years. That's how long it took the LGBTQ rights movement to overturn Bowers v. Hardwick, which was decided in 1986. That was overturned in 2003. So it's not impossible, but because we have a divided system of government and checks and balances, and because the court has been captured, all of these legislative plans that sound great and I support, like the Women's Health Protection Act that would legalize abortion across the country, that's going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. And so, or I would argue that it is. And so I'm hesitant to spend our political capital passing a law that we know is going to get overturned by the Supreme Court when we need to think about the structures of government that have been captured by the right, and to make those structures more democratic and reflective of, you know, the multiracial vision and democracy that has never happened in this country, but I think we need to make happen.
Listen, no participant or person listening to the recording can ever say that you don't have actionable steps to work toward. Each of these esteemed panelists has given us measurable, specific, actionable steps toward reclaiming, if you will, our reproductive freedoms. And so thank you all for that. Now, we still have 10 minutes, so stay along with us. We are going to attempt to get through the next two questions. The next one is fiery though, so I don't know how far we'll get, but let's try it. Because two of you brought up something that was actually the next question. The question is, please limit your responses to 1 minute each, if that is humanly possible at this point. Since Roe v. Wade has been overturned, in your view, what do you feel that school systems should have the responsibility to teach regarding abortion rights? And I'm going to add to that. What do you suggest is the most feasible avenue for that specific framework of teaching about abortion rights to successfully happen in our school systems? Basically, in summary, we're not asking you for a long dissertation here. We're just saying in general, how do you think, is it even feasible? Will it ever happen? What angle you want to tackle this question from? Go for it.
So I think it's dependent on where you are, unfortunately. So if you're in a state where abortion rights have been taken away and basically autonomy is no longer a right for you, it does make it difficult for especially public school systems to build out curriculum that speaks to reproductive health and abortion rights. That being said, I know that there's underground work where teachers are taking that step, and it's part of the advocacy work of taking that step to build in equitable education that has an anti-racist framework, that it is inclusive of LGBTQ and transgender and gender diverse folks, that speaks to how kids, I'm saying kids because it's middle and high school where sex ed and health education start to come up, can get access and resources if they ever run into any reproductive health issues. So before I go into a dissertation, I want to quickly say, yes, it is the responsibility of school systems to teach. You have to, because health education and sex education is part of a social determinants of health. And to the points that were relayed earlier, reproductive health is part of a social determinants of health. So it is a responsibility for schools to teach. And in terms of like the feasible, whether it's feasible, it is. It's feasible in blue states because we have the freedom and ability to do it. But if you're in a state where that's not the case, there's still ways for you to disseminate information, whether it's through underground networks or bringing in speakers to speak on your behalf and teach on your behalf from states that allow us to do that.
I just want to say that I love your expertise and response, because what you have pointed out, at least what I gathered from it, was not only the education, but in those schools, they also need access to the resources. So thank you for that. Dr. Laurie, what do you have to say about this?
You know, it's really interesting because when I was growing up, I'm just going to tell you a really quick story. When I was growing up in a predominantly white community, my parents wanted me to understand about civil rights. They wanted me to understand about racial injustice. And so we went to Freedom School. I don't know if people are aware of Freedom School, but it was a week and it was in our local church. And they got all of the Black kids together and we learned about our history. We learned about civil rights. So I think that you can learn in your families, you can learn in your communities and community center programs, church programs, other organizations. We do not have to leave this. And I think Ndidi was actually, mentioning this as well. We don't have to leave it to the schools. Now, I will say that it's important to do that immediately so that the information can get to the young people and to some of the older children as well. But while we're doing that, we should also be pushing and making it happen in the schools and trying to be as strategic as we can in terms of how we do it. Sort of saying we have to have a balanced curriculum. We have to provide this perspective and that perspective. So there's ways to do it. And we should look at other states that have been able to really put forth good educational programs around reproduction, gender and race, and see how they went about doing it. So choosing models, providing this information through alternative means, and at the same time, fighting for it to be done in schools. So a three-pronged approach or a multi-pronged approach, I would suggest.
Wow. Listen, we need to place you all on a billboard somewhere with some loudspeakers. That was excellent. Specifically, the fact that you mentioned modeling patterns. If there are already patterns that are effective or structured systems that are working currently, why reinvent the wheel? Going back to modeling those patterns, obviously would be helpful and most efficient. Thank you for that. Professor Jennifer and Meredith, take us away.
Well, I think I'm going to open the door. So what the sister said made sense.
We'll close it in part 2.
But we have to look at the fact that many of the school systems in many of these states,
they're not going to do it.
They're not going to do it. But we have to also focus in on the fact that there's a lot of racism behind the stigma of abortion. So we know numbers. We know non-Hispanic white women is 36% abortions. We know non-Hispanic Black women is 30% abortions. We know Hispanics 25%. We know other women are 9%. But when you think about it, you look at the full picture of all those percentages, the higher number of abortions are in the non-Hispanic white women, right? And a lot of the women that are now coming up, the new generation, are thinking more about career than they are about children giving birth. They're not doing it until later in the years, right? So some of these conservative people across the board, male, female, Black, white, so on, that are against abortion are seeing the race, the white race shrinking while the disenfranchised community are growing, right? So they see it more as there's more Black babies out there, there's more Asian babies out there, then there are, their white women giving birth. So we have to think those subconscious biases are not going to allow them to do any form of education or teaching in the school system because they already see it as it's stopping the growth of their community, their culture, so we have to talk about that too. I know I throw out all hard things, but those are things we have to talk about.
No, I think you're so right, Meredith. And I think when we're thinking about abortion, and we're thinking about reproductive justice in the Scottish decision, we have to think about it in the context of, galloping inflation, rising gas prices, grocery store costs, economic insecurity, and as you mentioned, systemic racism, xenophobia, and the general lack of regard for people of color. So when you think about the critical race theory controversies going on, it's really in that same mode. There is a fear of the truth, and there's a fear of things, the truth being told and what that means. And I think you're absolutely right. All of this is really rooted in, again, the racism, the xenophobia, and a lack of regard for low-income people, people of color, and other disenfranchised groups. And I think the other thing that's really important to raise around this issue is that when we're talking about access to abortion, we also understand that, particularly for women of color and in some other disenfranchised groups, that what we're seeing is that there's, high rates of infant mortality, low birth weight, preterm delivery, and birthing violence, right? And so those particular statistics are only going to become worse. And so we have to think about this also in the context of birth outcomes. And sometimes we don't tie the two together, but they do, they do connect to each other in many ways. And I think, if we're going to educate people, we need to educate them that these things are all tied together. There's a framework that we're looking at.
This is critical, and it has been tied together, at least the beginning of this conversation. And we're grateful for you pointing that out, lest we look at this issue singularly focused. So with that being said, we do want to honor you all time. I know that Professor Jennifer hasn't responded here, but we will have you out 3 minutes after the time we said, so just hold on tight. I would like to simply know very briefly in one sentence or less, what would you all say as we prepare to leave here? What would you all say to the folks who just feel hopeless at this point? I mean, it's been overturned. People feel like they have nowhere to turn. What would you say to them? And 2 responses are sufficient, and we're going to pick up at this point for part 2 on February the 1st, everyone, from 6 p.m. to 7:15 p.m. You do not want to miss it.
Thank you, Dominique. When I saw that question, I thought about so many different things, but I want to give snippets, and I hope everybody picks up what I'm giving. My suggestion, if you're feeling hopeless, let's create a room of our own. Freedom from death. Women's rights are human rights. I, a woman, make some trouble on behalf of women, and freedom from fear. It is a revolution. With hope, good morning. And guess what? My body is a weak, feeble woman's body, but my heart and my stomach is that of a king and a queen, right? So when you think about all the women before us that did all those speeches and talked about empowerment, enrichment, enhancement, and doing something actively for women and girls, don't think that it's hopeless. See the hope, see the future, and be part of that. Take the challenge to be a part of that. And that's all I can suggest to you. Be a part of making change.
Love that. Love that. Professor Jennifer, you can end us out with responding to this question. And for our other esteemed panelists, we will pick back up part 2. Don't you worry.
I'm not sure I can add on to what Mary said, except to say that if you look at that Google Doc that I posted prior, I don't have any words of inspiration, but I'm going to refer you to Miriam Kaba, who talks about hope being a discipline. She's a great abolitionist and wrote a book about that. I'm going to refer you to Rebecca Solomon, who's talked about hope. And I'm going to also post here a link to an op-ed from the New York Times that I have my students read, written by a historian of the civil rights movement that she wrote after Judge Kavanaugh was confirmed to the Supreme Court, and talking about how failure is part of the process, and that part of being person who works for social justice is accepting that we might not see the victories that we hope to see in our lifetimes, but we do it for our children and for our future. So
incredible perspective. And I love that hope is a discipline. Everyone, we thank you for your patience. Nandini, did you want to say anything? I didn't want to, I mean, you are the reproductive equity specialist after all.
No, I think if you give into hopelessness, it makes advocacy hard. It makes making change hard. And I know it's a burden to carry to be hopeful when there are a lot of things that are moving against you. But having hope gives you the courage to move forward and to fight for your autonomy and to fight for your freedom. So keep it up, chin up. I cannot express that more. I know it's exhausting. Lord knows I am, but I keep going because if I don't have hope, then my work becomes very hard. So keep your chin up. Hope gives you the courage to move forward.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for your patience. Thank you to each esteemed panelist. We hope to see you back on February 1st now. The Zoom link and all of that will be provided to you close, probably in January, just because we're entering the holidays. And so prepare for that. We look forward to seeing you. And as hope is a fuel yourself here for part 2. We'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care now. Have a great and beautiful evening.
Good evening. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.